George Washington was born here, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, in 1732. He was a fourth-generation Virginian. His father's name was Augustine, his mother's name Mary Ball. At age 3, his father moved the family to Little Hunting Creek and built this house. P.S. This house later evolved into Mount Vernon. His father got an itch again and moved the family outside of Fredericksburg to another farm he owned called Ferry Farm. This is where George really grew up and learned to be a farmer. His father died in 1743 when George was only 11. Because of his father's death, George Washington would never secure a formal education. George's first occupation was that of a surveyor. In 1752, his older half-brother Lawrence takes him on a trip to the Barbados. George would catch smallpox there. Because of this, George would never have biological children in his lifetime. Lawrence was like a father to George. Unfortunately, he died right after they got back from that trip to the Barbados. Lawrence had actually taken possession of Little Hunting Creek after their father Augustine had died, and he was the one who would rename the property Mount Vernon. A few years after Lawrence's death, Washington inherited Mount Vernon, but it still looked like this at the time, though. Washington first became a global figure at the age of 21. At that young age, he was to deliver a message in the name of His Britannic Majesty to the French, who were hanging out here in a fort called Le Boeuf. George told the French that they had to ditch, but the French said, of course, no. This led to a bunch of fighting that lasted 7 years. In 1754, Washington returned to the Ohio country with the Virginia Regiment, intent on securing the strategic territory which lie between the rivers Allegheny and Monongahela. He shortly learned that the French had built a fort called Duquesne. Emboldened, after winning a short skirmish at the battle that has come to be known as Jumonville Glen, Washington thought his vastly outnumbered detachment could stand their ground until reinforcements arrived, and thus erected a crude fort that has come to be known as Necessity. This early blunder would stick with Washington his whole life, as his detachment faced total annihilation, and he was forced to capitulate to the French. The next year, in 1755, the British sent the seasoned general, Edward Braddock, on a campaign to capture Fort Duquesne, with the eventual goal of seizing all of French Canada. General Washington came along for the ride to glean any knowledge that he could and to offer his advice to General Braddock. Braddock's massive force crept west slowly, as it had to level a new road just to support it. Fearing that winter would come before his troops reached Duquesne, an advance force was sent ahead. Braddock, however, was accustomed to conventional European warfare. This force met with disaster, as it was surrounded by a large force of Indian and French soldiers. General Braddock met his demise in this skirmish. George Washington was left to rally the remaining troops, which he did so valiantly, if not miraculously. Though the battle was a disaster, George Washington left a hero, leading with courage after General Braddock had fallen. For the next 3 years, Washington was tasked with creating and commanding a new regiment, Virginia, which would defend the Ohio country. Washington's aim for the Virginia Blues was to synthesize the discipline of mainline British warfare with a kind of guerrilla warfare that came with dealing with marauding Indians. In 1758, when Washington was 26, the British made one final push to secure the Ohio territory and push the French out of Fort Duquesne. The Brits sent another seasoned general by the name of Forbes. Washington offered his advice to Forbes on what he had learned during the Braddock fiasco, and Forbes listened. Forbes required the British regulars to learn the forest fighting tactics Washington had been teaching his Virginia Blues, and even dispensed with their redcoats for the bluecoats that Washington had chosen for his regiment. The whole campaign ended in a rather anticlimactic moment. After arriving at Duquesne, the Brits learned that the French abandoned the fort, fearing annihilation at the hands of the massive British force. This campaign would end George Washington's first foray into military affairs. What would remain with Washington throughout his life due to his experience in the West was the notion that the future lay in those lands in the West. The wild country in the West was where fortunes and careers could be made for posterity, he thought. The next decade and a half found George Washington primarily at his estate in Mount Vernon. In 1759, he married the exorbitantly wealthy widow Martha Dandridge Custis. P.S. George had expanded the Mount Vernon estate to this point by that time. Martha would bring to the marriage 2 small children, a 4-year-old by the name of Jackie and a 2-year-old girl named Patsy. Martha would also bring to the marriage 3 plantations of about 18,000 acres in total. The marriage made it Washington's duty to manage these properties for his stepchildren to eventually inherit upon reaching majority at age 18. Unfortunately, Patsy suffered from epilepsy and would pass away at 17. Jackie was a profligate child. However, Washington was able to set him up at one of the Custis estates. He would have 4 children, which would survive past infancy before Jackie would pass away at age 26. One of the major developments on Washington's thinking during this time was his growing distaste for the British mercantile system. Prior to 1766, Washington's main product at nearly all his estates was tobacco. In fact, tobacco was the primary product of most of the Virginia gentry. Most of Washington's tobacco was sold on consignment, entrusted to the sale on the British market by a mercantile house in England. The other benefit of the mercantile houses to the colonists was that it allowed them access to purchasing goods from London. However, Washington felt he was continuously and deliberately being underpaid for his tobacco exports, while at the same time paying inflated prices for imports. He began to feel the mercantile system was deliberately designed to create dependency on the part of the colonists to the mercantile houses in London by generating indebtedness on the part of the colonists. In response, Washington made a change at his Mount Vernon estate. He began to grow wheat and other grains instead of tobacco, with the intention of selling these products locally. Following this, Washington began a campaign of independence from the mercantile houses of London. He constructed his own flour mill, built fisheries, manufactured linens, and so forth. And just as Washington had grown sick of the consignment system, Parliament in 1765 imposed the Stamp Act on the colonists. This was a first attempt at the imposition of a direct tax on the colonies, circumventing colonial elected bodies in order to alleviate the costs of an enormous British Empire, and more importantly, the growing sovereign debt which the Bank of England had generated. And indeed, this would be the idea which would be behind the Townshend duties, which placed a direct tax on certain goods the colonies imported from England. Washington's first role in public resistance to the British came in 1769 when he suggested at the Virginia House of Burgesses that there ought to be a colony-wide boycott of British manufactured goods, both as an act of disdain for the presumptive actions of Parliament and a promotion of self-sufficiency on the part of the colonists. Parliament would repeal many of the duties in response to the colonists' protests, barring one symbolic duty on tea as a sign of its supremacy over the colonists. This would famously lead to the Boston Tea Party. Parliament's response to the riot was to close the Boston port, to impose a set of coercive acts upon the colony of Massachusetts, and to impose martial law in Massachusetts. This was done in order to show the colonists that the ultimate power emanated from across the pond in Britain. In July of 1774, George Washington would chair a meeting held by influential Virginians that has come to be known as the Fairfax Resolves. The resolves concluded that there ought to be a convening of a Continental Congress to manifest a colony-wide boycott of British goods. In August of 1774, Williamsburg elected Washington as one of the delegates to send to Philadelphia for the First Continental Convention. Washington would return to Philadelphia the next year in 1775 for the Second Continental Congress. And it would be this Second Continental Convention which would eventually agree upon the famous Declaration of Independence. This seems a decent enough place to leave off on Washington's pre-Revolution years. P.S. By about 1775, Washington had expanded his Mount Vernon estate to 6,500 acres. Also, Washington began his final renovation on the mansion in this period, which would lead to the iconic look of Mount Vernon. All right, well, bye for now.